So for those watching, we'll figure this out later. I forgot to hit record. Mark, did you hit record?
I hit record, yeah.
Okay.
I think I hit record when you said you should hit record.
Did I say you should hit record? Or did I say I should hit
Yeah,
record?
yeah, you did.
And then I didn't. All right.
Mm-mm.
Okay. Well, we'll pretend. Can I rewind this just a second? I don't know that I can. Because it feels weird without the count working. People that watch the live stream are gonna be like, "What is wrong with
Professional
you
as
people?"
usual. As usual.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Let's go. No? Did it change your video? Didn't change mine. My computer's doing weird things. All right. Well, what in the world? I do that, and then I do that. That's us. Nope, no, I don't want to do that. I want to do that. Wow, Restream's having some issues. You don't see it counting down, do you?
No, it's stuck there.
All right. Well, we'll just call it. I'll mute myself. We'll start.
It's the Dev Friday Show with Mark and Tim.
All right. You know what is it? We test for regression, right, Mark? Like you've heard of testing for, regression testing. Make sure you didn't introduce an old problem. Well, I was going to open with that, and then it turns out like I forgot to do everything in the world, so I am full of human regressions. But one thing I did regress to, Mark, is I stopped using Podium to transcribe and summarize the podcast, and I decided to go back to Assembly AI, which we had used in the past, and it was interesting. Transcribing it, super cheap, right? Like cost almost nothing to get a transcription, and it does a better job than Podium because I can tell it that I mix it down stereo, so when it's looking for speakers, it doesn't confuse the two of us, or it doesn't try to figure out who we are. It just says, oh, one person's on the left, one person's on the right. So that works pretty well for the transcript. But then I asked it to give me a witty summary. And it did, believe it or not, it did a lot better job because Assembly has this, what they call the Lemur engine, which is based on Claude. They have the Lemur engine. I passed it the transcript and said, can you just give me a summary? And then I also gave it the last like 15 summaries that we have on the site and said, it's like in this style. And it did a pretty good job. But holy, it was expensive.
How much?
More than I actually had in there. If I understand what they're telling me, I basically spent more than I have. So I'm not sure what they're going to do about this. If they're gonna,
is it based on like a token or a credit system?
It is. So if I look at my usage right now, and what was interesting is I realized I was calling it by default. There's a basic model, and then there's just the default model. So by asking it, I think I asked it to summarize it once, and then I asked it to summarize it again. So that's two summaries I asked, and then I asked it to build me the chapter list, and that's where it kind of fell apart a little bit because I think it just has the transcript. It doesn't have the timestamps. And my understanding from talking with some of the Assembly AI devs is that I could actually package up the JSON structure that represented the transcript and send it back because that has the timestamps. And then maybe you could give me a chapter summary. But I decided just to use, they have an NLP style chapter detection. I did that. Its chapters are pretty good. They're definitely more detailed than Podium's was. But looking at this, that means I called with an hour's worth of transcription, which is our podcast, right? So it's not like I don't know. It's an hour's worth of content, right? Like it's probably about the same no matter.
It's an hour's worth of amazing content.
Well, yeah, but I mean, like if you think of something else that you had transcribed in an hour, like say it was a lecture, something like that, it's probably the same amount of words or tokens, right? Like that's what we care about, right?
True.
So I think I called
especially when we're trying to talk over each other.
Yeah. Oh, because we have two. We mix it down to two channels, so we can get the crossover is transcribed probably pretty accurately as far as I can tell. So I asked it 3 questions. Now the token count of my prompt I think is insignificant considering the rest of that. I mean, it wasn't a big token count for my prompt. When I asked it with Lemur default, it looks like they're saying that I spent $12.
That's
so
pricey.
Three questions, $12.
Is for one episode?
Yeah, that's running it through an hour recording.
Wow,
3 times.
We are going to need a sponsor to pay for this then.
Assembly AI,
We're running
not a
in the
sponsor,
red.
not a sponsor. Maybe they could be a sponsor and just comp us all that. You hear that, Assembly?
We're gonna bankrupt our own show, Tim.
But I bankrupt your show, which makes no money. So pretty much started that way. But I switched over to the basic model and asked it again because I was an idiot. And I kept just using curl on the command line. Well, not curl, but HTTP. Have you ever used HTTP?
No, wait, I've heard it. Wait, explain it to me. Maybe I've done it in the past.
It's weird because it's HTTP-IE. So when you say it, it's like
No, actually, I've not.
HTTP.
No, I've not.
I'm going to offend some people, I'm sure, that worked on curl. But like command line curl, which is what curl is, right? Command line URL. It's what curl should have been, in my mind. The way that because if you've ever done curl, like it's ridiculous, the arguments. And HTTP just has a really simple interface. It lets you do a lot of things easily that are a bit tedious in curl. And it calls, I don't know, I think it says for JSON's default. So if I make a post and I say first name equals Tim, last name equals Lytle, it will structure that as JSON, not as a form URL encoded. Now you can tell it to do form URL encoded, but by default, you give it key values and it turns them into JSON, which makes sense if you're trying to just, what I was doing last night, play with an API from the command line, makes it super easy.
Especially like, because it's designed for testing APIs, what it looks like. Yeah, it has a nice site. If you go to http://ie.io. Yeah, it's nice.
Yep. And
have to try it out.
And it pretty formats the response too. So you get the streamed response back. Yeah. But I was an idiot because I asked the Lemur API just on the command line to get a summary of the show. And it gave me a couple good ones. And then I asked to do something else. And it was a rather long response because I retranscribed to get the chapters the way I wanted them. And that took up all the history of my terminal.
So it's interesting. You are doing all of this at the command line. You're not using. I just messing around. You're not using their web UI in any way. Because when you were talking about this, I assumed you're doing this through their
oh no, I don't think they have
I don't
think they have a web UI.
So it's purely through command line. Oh, interesting.
It's an API.
Gotcha.
So I was actually able to take our audio. They have one endpoint where I can upload the audio, and then I refer to that and said, "Hey, please transcribe this." And that's where I should have said auto detect the chapters, because their NLP is decent. It's decent at that. A whole lot more detailed than Podium was. So I just pushed it. So once it gets online, you'll see that our chapter for last week has a whole lot more chapters than normal. And I think it's because it kind of isolates sub things, right? Like it had a chapter mark for After Effects where we talked about After Effects, and then the countdown video specifically. And there's a couple times where we get a Roller Coaster Tycoon. We talked about how that was written in assembly, and then we also talked about how you used to like to play it. So that we could, but that's nice, right? It's nice that you could jump wherever you wanted. So, but I had to call it a couple times because I had scrolled through my terminal history, and then I decided to re-ask it to do a summary of the podcast in that kind of lighthearted my tone. Gave it the example, and I switched not to their default model but to their basic model. And that, I think, again, I called it about 3 times, and that cost me $3.20.
Wow.
So the basic
feels pricey.
But 3 times for $3.20. When you think of the size of and it's here's where I want to go with it though. Like just looking at this, because remember, I was paying for Podium roughly $9 for an hour's worth of audio for them to transcribe it, give me a summary. But remember, that summary felt like we were NPR. It was ultra stuffy, and chapters. So it looks like if I use Lemur Basic, I could get about the same, because transcription costs nothing. To transcribe this, an hour's worth of text to speech, I don't even know. Well, it'll tell me speech to text. It's not even, I haven't even spent $1 yet. I think it's like 12, 13, 14 cents to transcribe it. And so for that, plus a couple queries to the LLM on a basic level, cost me about $3. So when you look at the delta there, I'm paying $9 with Podium. I mean, we spin up a quick little startup here, and just call Assembly AI behind the scenes, and we can build a Podium replacement for not that.
Where do you think the primary cost is coming from? Like, how are they deriving that?
I don't know, because I don't think Claude's that expensive, but it might be. I mean,
well, if you look at like the per kind of token cost, if you would just look at,
well, I can tell you what the tokens are too. Like someplace here, I should be able to see the tokens. Yeah. So essentially, now this is all of them combined, both my basic usage and my expensive usage. So figure, I think, because I was just messing with it, I think 6 or 7 requests was 104,000 tokens. Okay. So when you think about the amount of information that is in a transcript, because it's an hour's worth of content, right? That's a lot of text.
Yeah, because I'm looking at the pricing, because I'm not sure what the infrastructure where their hosting is from, but if you look at the pricing for Amazon Bedrock for the Claude, was it Claude 3?
I don't know if they're on Claude 3 or 4, honestly.
Okay.
My guess says they're probably on 4. I don't know.
Oh, okay. So they're not showing pricing for that, but say the Claude 3. So do you think
Claude? You know what? Maybe Claude 3 is basic.
Yeah, maybe
that would make sense.
Because like just doing a price per 1,000 tokens is 0.03 of a cent.
300.
Well, if you say like cent? 0.003.
0.3 cents.
Well, no, not 0.3 cents. 0.003. No, 0.003.
But is that $0.003 or 0.003 cents?
No, of a dollar. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so it's 0.3 cents. So, and you said that's 1,000?
Per 1,000 tokens, yeah.
So we did 100 of those.
Yeah.
That's not, I mean, okay, now I can see the scale there. And my understanding is Assembly AI has tuned Claude for this type of
this purpose, yeah.
Because they do have a couple special endpoints. They have a summary.
And there's a cost involved with that for the tuning, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I just use what they call their task endpoint, whereas you give it the transcript or text of a transcript. And that's where, like, I think their developers would tell me, if you want to know the summary with timestamps, give it the actual JSON we gave you back, because when you just reference the transcript, I don't think that goes to Claude. I think it's just the transcript, because when I asked it to come up with chapter summaries, it came up with some decent chapter summaries. The times were just obviously wrong. So it must not have had the context for that. So their API works where you could give it a transcript ID or the text, which could be JSON structured data of a transcript, and then a prompt. And that's what they call their task API. But they also have like a summary API, which is tuned for obviously summaries, where you give it the same thing. Here's either the transcript reference or the actual text of a transcript. And then you give it a prompt that describes what type of summary you want. And they also allow you to give it a format that you want it in. So if you're saying, hey, for the podcast, I want a quick title, a 3-sentence summary, and then chapter divisions. It might be able to do that. Now I have to test it out, but I'm curious to play with what Assembly AI has for Claude, and then also take the same structured data that they give me for a transcript and pass it to Claude directly. Because that's my thought, right? Like I mean, I know this is how I structure it to interest Mark, right? If we spun up a startup here, right? We build it on Assembly AI. We say, give us your podcast audio.
I don't know if that's a right business choice. It sounds expensive to me.
Right. It will give me this, give me your podcast audio. And like we build the Podium clone, right? You give me the podcast audio. I give you, and that was interesting because I could kind of see.
Hey, Tim, I already have a domain for that.
What, you do?
I do. What, and actually it's part, I have an idea.
What? Already?
Podboost.me.
Podboost me.
Boost your podcast.
There you go. We already got it. Podboost me. Not a sponsor. It's actually the.
Well, it's because I've been putting this together as we've been talking week by week about ideas of how we could automate what we do.
Oh,
and you know me. Okay. And if I'm going to be doing something like this, I always think, okay, could this be a business, right? Because that's where my mind always goes that way, right?
This is how I get Mark motivated.
Could other podcasters use this automated service where basically
it's going to fail, but.
Well, basically, where if you just have a very simple interface, like you're doing everything through the command line, which sounds like a lot of work.
A lot of work. So much work.
And a normal person would not do that.
No, normal people don't do that.
But if you just had an automated system where you just dropped your podcast file or your set of files, like if you had two audio files for the different tracks, maybe your bumper, your pre-roll, post-roll, and then it just does everything that we're talking about automatically.
Part of me would be fascinated if we could take. Yeah, there's a couple places to go here. One, I joke because like this is how to motivate Mark, because like there's a startup, it's going to fail, but if we think it might succeed,
there's nothing more that excites me than thinking about a startup that's probably going to fail.
Right, but if we think it could succeed, man, we'll give it a shot. So I'm just, because I could see Podium work this way. The first time I used it, they had no UI. It was like, give us the audio, here's a zip file with text, and then a month or two later, give us the audio, here's a nice little interface that says, oh, open your transcript, open your summary, and we show it to you in the browser. It's like, oh, that's nice. It's not significantly different, but you can see we're doing the bare minimum. So like we could build, this is just a thought exercise, right? We could build the Podium replacement on Assembly AI, which, to be honest, my gut says Podium is using Assembly AI. Just because I've used them both, I have this feeling they probably are. But then we could take a step back, and I would love to analyze, well, how much better for our particular use case is taking an hour's worth of transcribed content and having Assembly AI's tuned version of Claude make a summary versus using just Claude running on Amazon Bedrock, right? Because we're going to see a huge price difference there. And it's like, as you iterate, you can say, all right, we got it up and we've got like 3 podcasts that use this. Great. That's $30 a month if we're charging it. It's not a lot. But then we can take our cost out and then go from saying it costs us $3 to $5 for an hour of audio to maybe now it costs us less than $1 for an hour of audio, because transcription is pretty much free. It's cheap, right? Yeah. It's less than $1. And then if we can tune Claude for our own purposes, then and run it on Bedrock, which is less expensive, if we get a better or the same result, then we're able to take the cost out.
That's what's really interesting to me. Like all these services that are, focused on a specific kind of segment of AI.
Right.
And you're right. There's a cost for tuning these models, and there's time, labor, computing cost, everything like that. So I totally understand that. But I am curious, like, just like if you if you use Bedrock for their models, or if you actually just use open AIs and just, pay for just using their raw models that you have, how, from a quality standpoint,
how much different?
How do they compare?
Yeah. I'm super curious to maybe play with that. And then the other place is you're talking about PodBoostMe.
It's a great name.
PodBoost.me.
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 It's a PodBoost me.
Can't say it enough. PodBoost.me. My thought is, we've talked about this, and now that I'm going back to Assembly AI, like Assembly gives me a really rich JSON structure that has what it, if you look at the structure, it's something that's called, I think it's utterances, and it'll have my dialogue, and then as you say something, it'll have yours.
Yeah, that's nice.
But it'll have it'll have the timestamp of each word. So, okay. And the timestamp of each word would marry very well to a player, right? Because imagine being able to scroll through a transcript and then just click on a word and it takes you there in the player. So from a productization standpoint, right? You give me an hour of audio, we transcribe it, we build your chapters, right? You give us samples of your past, because this is the idea, this is the pitch, right? Like, you're an established podcast. We want to automate your manual work. So if you had summaries before as part of your system, you give us those summaries, and we write you a summary that is very similar to what you've done in the past. And then, though, there's an embeddable, like, Stripe-like player where the player and the transcript live together, and you can scroll through the transcript or the chapters, and just as you click on chapters, or you scroll through the transcript and click on a word, the player takes you right there. And that, as a product, seems like, I mean, I don't know that it would ever be successful, but it seems like something that you could say, oh, other people might use. It's not just for
I do think, and there's services that do provide the podcast hosting services, where you basically just upload your files, all the information we're talking about, you basically upload it to the service, and the service then would produce the XML file, the RSS.xml file for the actual podcast.
Yeah.
And they would host the file, they would host the actual audio files, and then the XML file, and they would also push it out to, let's say, Apple Podcasts or
Did
Spotify,
aggregated and
and
stuff
yeah,
like that,
so that gives you. There's a lot of services that do that, but talking, and they're probably implementing these features we're talking about with the kind of automatic transcription and
Probably,
everything like that. So I do think, but for normal people who want to do podcasts, like my wife is going to be doing a presentation next week at a writers conference, and writers are just thinking about, how can I start my own podcast? How can I talk about the books that I'm writing?
Well, podcast at me.
Exactly. How could I get on other shows? But having a service, they basically, okay, if you can record your own audio, just send that file to someplace, and then maybe have a little bit of options for like just to make it sound nice at the beginning and the end, and just host the file and do everything for you.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people that need that service. So,
and where you were going, and I think it'd be fascinating to see if we could do, because I've explained my process before, where I take your track, I take my track, and then I have this, what I call a podcast container track, which has our bumper music at the start and the end. And then I sync it up with Restream's track, because Restream's track, I can hear the bumper music that played on Restream. So I sync that with my bumper music. And then I sync my voice with what I sound on Restream, and your voice with what you sound on Restream. And with that, we sync them all together. And I don't know, probably there is something out there. If there's some machine learning style thing that, like Socks plus, if I say Socks, do you know what Socks is? I was talking about the other day with
it's the financial thing, right?
No, not stocks.
No, socks. No, there's like a socks it's like a standard or policy. I don't know.
Oh, really?
No,
No, but Socks, the command line utility, SOX, is like the Swiss Army knife of audio on the command line. It is fascinating. It's just one of those things where you're like, who wanted to build this, but also thank you. And I use it all the time to say, once I have a left and a right of you and me, I just say, Socks, mix these two together so they're 2-channel audio, and that's what we use for the transcription. It'll convert files, you can split files, you can chunk files on timestamp.
I thought you were talking about the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002.
See, there are parts of us that we differ on a lot. So
we're just Socks.
I was not talking about that.
SOX.
No,
because that's what came to my mind when you asked me do I know what it is.
Yeah. No, it's a command line utility audio, or a command line audio utility for mixing and splitting and chunking audio and doing all sorts of format conversions and things like that. But like that plus some machine learning that could say, oh, this is the key track to tie everything to. So then figure out what time shift you have to do to this recording from Restream to make it sync with that. And then figure out, because there's going to be similar audio between these two other tracks, how to sync them with the Restream, and then delete the Restream. And if I could automate what I do by hand with Sonar, that'd be fun, because you could just say, if you could upload your track, my track, and Restream to a system that already has our base container of the podcast, and it slid everything together and then mixed the two, transcribed it, built the summary. I mean, there'd be no work.
So let's talk about the future of these AI platforms or these tools, because as you were talking about, the token costs of how expensive it got. I experienced something similar. If you go to v0.dev, this is a tool that was made by the developers. I believe is one of the developers who make Next.js, and it's v0.dev.
Like the word zero, the number
zero. Yeah, v0.
Okay.
So this is a tool basically to type in the type of interface that you want to have, and it'll generate the interface as React code, and specifically to be used. I think it's using another framework that does the more styling of the UI, which you can actually, it's with the Shad CN framework, but it basically just generates React code based on prompts. And so it's pretty interesting. It's a little bit slow right now, but I was trying it for 1 week just to kind of see if I could use it as part of my workflow. Saying, okay, if I need to generate some admin UI, where, like I was talking about for that client, for that one Next.js site, it's like, could I just automatically generate the UI just to speed this up, and I could just copy paste the code, get me started. But what I was finding though is as you're trying to iterate through the UI, it was a bit slow. That was kind of annoying.
Iterate through prompting it to get different versions
to get the right version of the UI that I want.
Yeah.
But that also entails tokens, right? So they give you,
Mhm.
let's say, a free set of tokens, like I think it's like 200 tokens. You're going to start running through those tokens pretty fast. So a
Mhm.
lot of these services use this token idea, which I totally understand why they're doing it, because the models that they're using, the platforms that they're interfacing with, there's a cost associated with that based on
Right.
the token cost that they're paying, and then they're trying to pass that cost off onto the subscriber, the user, and it does feel like pay per use in a sense, and I do love that,
Well, it is,
especially
yeah.
from a cloud computing standpoint. It's great, but it feels like a really expensive
Like an
pay per
expensive pay
use.
per use. Yeah.
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 So is that? Do you
Like
think that
like
that's
going like going to an arcade, right?
yeah?
Where
Yeah.
they like divorce your ID, they try to obfuscate the notion of money because you buy
Mhm.
credits, right? And then you're like, "Oh, this is only 10 credits." Well, you don't even know what that means anymore. And
It's much better when you could just put those quarters in.
was that you just
I
stick them in
spent
the
so
pinball
many days
machine.
in an arcade. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I was thinking about, do you think this is going to be kind of continue on with this? I know most of these tools are made for developers or I don't know, professional scientists, and they're kind of fine with it. But or is it going to go to more of like a general subscription model, or
That's a really interesting question because you've I don't is ChatGPT, OpenAI is my understanding, I may be wrong, is losing money on ChatGPT. Like it costs them more than it
Mm,
brings in.
because I think that their premium subscribers is only like
It's
less
only
than
20
It's like
20
less than 10,
bucks.
or it's
Oh, and it's
less than 10%. I heard of the actual
right.
users. Yeah.
And so I get that they're losing money on the free side, on the
Yeah.
on the ChatGPT 3 users that have a free account. I am curious though, and I don't know, maybe this has been published. It probably has. I don't follow it enough. Are they actually even making money on the paid side? Like if you took all the free usage out and said, forget about that. Let's just look at the cost to run the models for and execute for the users that are paying us $20 a month. And because they have the restriction where it's bumped up a little bit. But so many queries, which are queries, honestly, not tokens, which kind of, disposes people to want to write perhaps a little bit longer questions and expect longer responses if you know that you're going to be doing work that runs out after a while. That you're gonna hit your message limit in ChatGPT. But I wonder if they're even making money on that side because of the fact that it's a fixed cost, $20 a month, for something that is really pay per usage in terms of using the models most of the time on this cloud infrastructure. And who knows, because like who knows what Mike, with Microsoft and OpenAI's relationship, who knows
Well,
where the actual
that-
costs are
that's
anymore.
that's what I was going to say. Like, if you can't make money, then just sell your company to a bigger company for like
Right.
$80 billion. That'll solve a lot of your problems.
So
So,
that's it's a great
and then
question,
Microsoft
especially
can then use all that technology in their own tools,
right,
right?
which they
So,
are. You have
yeah,
Copilot that they want to use
yeah.
everywhere now. It's not just GitHub Copilot. It's I guess, is
It'd
it
be
Windows Copilot?
it'd be Microsoft Word Copilot.
Right.
Yeah.
And we need to give the appropriate nod to Clippy, because I think Clippy was the one who started all this way
Oh,
back in the day.
poor little Clippy. Everybody hated on the Clippy. I didn't mind the Clippy. He's kind
But
of
that's what Copilot. That's to
never
me.
really
That's
used
what I
it, but
see
it was kind of fun to
Copilot.
see it pop up every now and then.
Yeah,
Back
it's
in
like,
what is
hey,
that?
can I help you with this document? It looks like you don't know to hit
Yeah.
the template button. But that's kind of isn't that what Copilot is? And then Google's got, is it Gemini? I think
Yep.
it's Google Gemini.
Actually, and I
and
think I
that's what's
told you
running on your phones now.
I'm mostly using Gemini now, mostly because they gave me like 2 months free for their advanced.
Oh
like,
yeah,
it's Gemini Advanced. So I've been actually using it every day, and it's not too bad. Especially I like it for reviewing just kind of basic paragraphs that I want to just make sure
Mhm.
to check it with grammar. As long as you give the right prompt, don't revise, as in don't rephrase.
Oh, like,
It
don't
does, and
try to.
it does a good
Yeah,
job, and maybe it'll change like one sentence around, but
yeah.
actually the change they make is actually pretty good. So I'm liking. Also, I do like how it when you ask it for for recommendations of, let's say, specific services, or if I want to know more about a framework that I wanted to learn about, it won't give
Oh,
me a huge amount of information, which I do find that ChatGPT just really kind of overloaded you with a lot of information at first. Gemini
yeah.
kind of gives you a nice set of information in lists, and then you can kind of then ask it again to kind of describe more about a specific area you want to learn more about. So I do like the format a little bit better.
Yeah. Is that what's running? Do you know if that was running on the phone too? Because I know the Google Android, or I don't know. I don't know if it's just on the Google Pixels, the Google Experience devices, but Google Assistant is now powered, I think, by, I don't know if it's Gemini or one of their other
Yeah,
models.
I know they
it's
were looking to get it
decent.
integrated with everything else. So yeah,
It's
probably.
decent. You'll find this. I'm going to say you'll find this interesting. I'm assuming because I know your wife's an author. But my 11-year-old is writing a book. She's a big fan of some middle school. This is where I'm not as familiar with like the different classifications. I know young adult fiction, is a classification. Before that, I guess it's called middle grade. I forget what it, but anyway, I was asking it because she's there writing. She's like, I don't know, 10 chapters into this book that she's been writing. And I just, instead of asking like Google, which I would normally just Google this question, right? But I pulled up Google Assistant, which I know now is using one of their AI models. I'm like, hey, what's the average length of a young adult novel? And it gave it to me in words, which I wanted, because then we looked at her words and she was only 20% there. And I'm like, is that really? And then I started saying, well, she likes, what is it? I think it's the Magic Tree House or something like that is books she likes reading. And I said, what is that, young adult? She's like, no, that's I think middle school fiction or middle grade fiction or something like that. I said, okay, what's the average length of that? And it gave me the average length of that. I said, okay, well, she's written this many words. Can you give her an idea of how far along she is? And it did that in a way that was, kind of nice for her to see. So it was an interesting use, where it used to be I'd Google it to find the information and I'd do the math myself, to just set up the context in this conversation with Google Assistant and have it do the math, which generally speaking, I've seen sometimes where large language models got the math wrong, but generally speaking, they know enough, at least from what I can observe that they're doing, to essentially write the code to ask the question and then tell you what the answer is. But no, back to your question. It's a great question as to, are we going to move to usage based? Because we're kind of, from a consumer standpoint, we're used to it's either free because it's part of my phone, or I pay so much a month for it, to have access to that. Especially, I'm guessing you're going to get Copilot with your Office 365 subscription. If you have a subscription to Office, I mean, why wouldn't they bundle it there? So that's a great question.
Well, now that those listeners who listen to the show,
right,
because they expected for us to talk about serverless WordPress.
Well, we're almost there. It's only halfway through.
I think that's the overall theme of our show, where we title our shows not knowing, maybe having some idea we're going to talk about, but then if we do have a real good title, we won't get to it till the end. Anyway,
not until the end. But yes, we ended last show with you talking about how you had. Now you said it's serverless, but I looked at your.
It's almost purely serverless.
It's almost.
So I have a solution, and I did open source this, but if you go to my website, markherberline.com.
Not a sponsor. just
a slave to the show.
I see it. I see.
I have a blog post that I kind of did a write-up on this, and also I have links to the project, the WordPress. I have a repo that I open source a version of this that isn't tied to my website, but just as if somebody wanted to kind of use this construct, the CDK construct that I've developed. So I wanted to host WordPress on AWS, but do it in a serverless way.
And I'm super curious about this because I'm looking at the diagram now, and serverless, like, help me understand. Like, you just don't want to deal with the EC2 directly.
So
right?
Before, and I have hosted WordPress websites on Amazon. The way you could do it, you have an EC2 instance. You could just have an EC2 instance with the WordPress install and the database also running. That's it. It's probably, but that's most the
that would be straightforward the
simplest way to go. Well, the simplest probably is using something like your it's escaping me, the automated service. Oh my gosh, my mind is
WordPress.com or
no. Well, that would be if you just want to go to the WordPress.com. But if you actually use the it's the AWS service for this, which I don't use it as much.
An AWS service for WordPress?
Oh, I'll come back to that because I was you got me thinking about something, totally distracted me on the fact. But there are
kind of how we run here.
it'll come back to me. So there are other services that'll also spin up the EC2 or the RDS instance and then do the WordPress install, set everything up for you, and that they do have ways to do that on AWS too. So
okay, but let's differentiate between that. That's having something automatically set you up what feels like a more complex structure. If I was going to say the simplest way to host it from a infrastructure standpoint, like the most basic way in my mind would be spin up a Linux, or probably I'm guessing there's a LAMP image, a AMI.
Yep.
Spin up a LAMP AMI and then just install WordPress on it and you're done. There you go, right? Well, yeah, because a LAMP should have MySQL running on it. So you spin up and you can, I mean, with the EC2, and if it's just your personal website, you can probably run that in the Amazon free tier, if I'm not mistaken. Is there still a free tier?
There is. I mean, I burned through that free tier so fast.
I was like
no,
the disdain in that answer. Yes, there's a free
if you create a new
tier.
account, if you select the T2,
right.
Small instance, I believe there's a couple of instances that fall within the free tier, and you kind of stick to the recommended
I just remember
instance sizes. You can, but then once you go off that, even if you do like a T2 micro or something like that,
I know it's so small.
It's so small, but it's not included the free tier. And I'm like, it just. So then I start doing my own thing, and I blow through the free tier so fast, and I get notices saying, "Oh, you've hit your maximum after before the end of the first month." I'm like, yeah, is what it is.
I just remember like there was, what is it? I don't know if it was the startup culture or the people that are like, yeah, can we figure out how to do this in the free tier? It's like, okay, guys, if you can't pay for it, maybe you should be doing it. But okay.
All right. So like I said, I've hosted WordPress in a bunch of different ways on AWS, but I wanted to do it in a serverless way as much as possible. And so I would also want to use the CDK. So I want to kind of see if I could kind of solve these problems that I was kind of thinking about. Like, how would I accomplish hosting a WordPress site and just doing it in a server site? So I did find a blog article that I also linked to from my blog post that I made that sort of outlined this. It gave it kind of a good starting point for this using ECS and using specific Fargate.
So ECS, I just want to make sure because I'm catching up on the terminology. ECS is their containers instead of EC2,
their elastic container. Yep.
Which is their EC2 is your I don't even remember. Compute. Their compute. So this is their container service. Okay, so ECS. So that's where you would throw an image someplace and say, hey, here's a WordPress image, like a Docker image.
Yeah. Yes. Well, sort of. We'll talk about where WordPress is installed and everything like that.
Yeah.
But you would actually run like a Fargate task. So you have the Fargate. The Fargate is the truly the serverless part of this, where the Fargate task that actually will run the actual WordPress instance in memory and kind of on the within that cluster, and that gives you
a Fargate task is a running container. Then
basically it's just running a container. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So you define the container, and then as normally you would do like a Docker container, which it is, and then it runs it within an ECS cluster, in a Fargate cluster, and then that gives you kind of the serverless kind of infrastructure for doing the compute part of it. Okay. Now there's a storage part of it, that's always a little bit tricky, especially with if you host it on, let's say, an EC2 instance, you have to have like your volume that's attached to that.
Right.
So if the volume is persistent, that's fine, and that's where you could host like your WordPress files, and that would work. But if you wanted to attach a volume to an actual like a Fargate task or like a container support,
and
you can still do that.
About your configuration, all the things that aren't just stock for WordPress install.
Yeah.
So, okay, but that's interesting. So you're saying your configuration isn't baked into your container?
No.
Okay.
Well, the actual WordPress install files are not in the container at all.
Oh, you're not even putting this is fast. Okay.
Yeah. So the task just runs, looks for the files, and basically runs the WordPress instance, or the web server.
Your
and everything
container
like that.
is basically just a PHP container.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it PHP Nginx? Is it all in one?
Yeah, Nginx. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's running that. And actually, no, I'm sorry. It actually is using it has two parts of this. It actually is using the container. If you look on the ECR registry, where you can actually get the containers, there is a WordPress, was it Bitnami? I forget for the acronym for it.
Okay, so
NAMI.
there's an existing container.
There's an existing container that gives you kind of the starting point for it. But the thing with that though is if let's say if these tasks fail or need to like start or stop, you want to have some persistence with it. So if that container if you just use like an EPS volume, but then you have to also attach this between multiple instances. Let's say for each of these tasks, think about it as like an instance. So if the load balancer is spreading the traffic and managing the instances, I'm going to be able to have some type of consistent file structure between them. And EBS volume, it can be attached. It can be attached like multiple tasks. You can attach to multiple EC2 instances if you want in some ways. But the EFS, the elastic file storage, that actually gives you the persistent storage you could then mount to each of these tasks that's running.
And you don't have to worry about it somehow, because the volumes sometimes they can be volatile, can't they? Like, again, I don't know that much about AWS.
Correct. And so what I'm using the volume for, pulling from that image is basically just for the base install. Like I said, talk about the base PHP install, the base file, the base WordPress files. But then let's say the files that need to stay persistent. So in a WordPress application, that's your theme files, that's your plugins
you're changing,
the images you're uploading, that has to stay persistent. And also, if I want to make sure that those persistent files are accessible, but from these different tasks that are also in different availability zones, you need to have some way to keep that. So you can actually mount an EFS volume, it's like a network. It's not a volume, but like an EFS mount to each of the tasks. So basically, it gives you like a path. So it gives you a path to a network file attached storage device that then is elastic, so to scale with it, and then it gets attached to each of these tasks. So that's where you store like the files that need to be persistent, like your theme files, your plugin files, your upload files, any configuration files, like your WP config that has to say persistent. That keeps all of your connections. So that's the part that's interesting, connecting, having a mount point that you can then mount within each of these tasks to this elastic file storage that then provides that persistence.
And so does that mean that the normal, like the WordPress core files, the PHP files that run, are those on the container then? Are they in that part of that container?
They are, yes. They are on the container that each of the tasks use. So that image, that initial image, that WordPress image,
it has I'm enough to run WordPress, and then we're mounting in the EFS mount to give me the theme, the configuration, the thing that makes this WordPress install mine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now I'm still running, and for the database part of this, you can't get away from having a relational database. I couldn't just connect this to DynamoDB. Which that would be nice if you could, and to run it because WordPress still requires like a relational.
Yeah, but you should be able to use RDS for that, right?
Yes. So use RDS. I did take a look at their Aurora serverless, and I priced it out. If I compare,
is Aurora like serverless RDS or something?
The Aurora, yes, the Aurora is their kind of their MySQL Postgres compatible database that is purely AWS. So it's a relational database that's SQL compatible.
Again, I don't play with this much, but you're saying if I spin up RDS, it's kind of obviously MySQL, and I will be able to tweak MySQL-y like things with it. And
it's just a managed database server.
Okay,
yeah. So
and that's launched in a particular availability zone. Okay, and it's just they're managing, but if I go in, I can log in and change some things, and it's like I'd be like admitting MySQL.
Yeah. So like I said,
if I do Aurora, it's different.
Well, there's two types of you have Aurora and you have Aurora serverless. I did take a look at the Aurora serverless. And so let's say my website probably doesn't get that much traffic. Let's say if it did scale and it had a huge amount of traffic, Aurora serverless would probably be a better option. But I did price it out comparing for like a very small instance, like an RDS, very small instance size, comparing that to running it like constantly in Aurora serverless. It's actually cheaper to do it with RDS.
Because your pricing model for Aurora serverless, I'm guessing is maybe monthly plus traffic.
Yeah, and it does scale, but scale down. But if you keep it running constantly, because usually also Aurora serverless is also intense. So if you did when it gets kind of scaled down, it doesn't go all the way down to zero. But if you want to say it where it's not being used, you can do that. But I do run it running all the time, right? I don't want any kind of like any boot up times or anything like that. I want to be able to have it just running. So an RDS instance was kind of the better way for me to do that. So it's still. But long term, though, if I wanted to really try to make that serverless, that would be kind of interesting to do.
At that point, do you get
move it
out of
over.
availability zones? Is it just like they just give you a database connecting URL? And
Well, you could do it as part. It works similar like a cluster format where you have
okay,
like your primary, and then you have like your readers, right? So you can it gives you like a sort of like a cluster that you can then work with.
So the application layer, you're configuring it like it would connect to a MySQL cluster.
Correct.
Gotcha.
So it's interesting. So it worked pretty well, and I've been running for a couple months. The cost is around less than $30, that was my goal.
That's
I wanted
about
to
comparable to a higher end WordPress host, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. So if I wanted to host this on, let's say WP Engine, it would be around like $30. So that was my goal. Can I host this myself in a scalable way? It's running, let's say, into availability zones within a load balancer. So you have right now I'm just running basically one task in each availability zone. But if I could easily just turn that on to, let's say, 2 to 4 tasks if I wanted to. If I wanted to add a little bit more, more horizontal scaling to this to kind of scale up the tasks. But it works pretty well between two different availability zones. The one thing that actually, when I first developed it, is 2 things from a cost perspective, because I was really mindful about the cost. I want to try to do this as cheaply as possible, but also try to make it as serverless as possible too. So that what I was finding though is I had this running for probably about 10 days. And I noticed that the projected cost was much, much more expensive than I thought it was going to be. And I realized that was because when what got spun up, when I used, there's a construct in the CDK that allows you basically do a lot of the work for you. Like it'll spin up your Fargate tasks. It'll connect them to a load balancer. It'll even spread them out between the availability zones inside of a cluster. So it does a good amount of work for you, but also gives you a managed NAT gateway, right? So I don't know if you know from a infrastructure networking standpoint what the NAT gateway is for. But if I want to have, let's say, my subnets in my availability zones, and you want to have like your public subnet and your private subnet, pretty much everything I'm talking about is in a private subnet, right? So it's not accessible to the internet at all. It could get connected. It could go out to the internet because of the load balancer and an internet gateway. So it could definitely access out. It can egress out, but there's no ingress into it unless you have. I'm sorry. It can unless it can actually.
You can connect to the VPC through a VPN, right? Then you can get into it.
Well, okay. So if I wanted to actually be able to have, like, say, updates on my WordPress install. So if you wanted, let's say, download a set of themes or plugin, or if I just want to, WordPress also makes a lot of calls out to the internet by itself, especially for rendering. It needs to have some way to kind of get out. So it can come in. So the data can come in, can read, can access the instances and be able to do that. And it provides that through like the internet gateway and the application load balancer. But if I actually want to have traffic from the instance to go to be able to make calls out, you need to have some type of NAT instance or managed NAT gateway. So the managed NAT gateway has some cost associated with it. It's at least, I think it's about $1 per day that you're running it. Wow. So that was the extra cost I didn't anticipate. I knew about that, but I totally forgot about it. And then also, since I'm running two availability zones, it's $2.
Oh, you're running. So you'd have to run two NAT.
Yeah, 2 managed NAT gateways. So to get around this, you could spin up your own, let's say, small EC2 instance, and then run it off a specific AMI that's designed for this, and you run like a NAT instance that in each of the subnets. And then in the CDK is a nice way you can just connect these together. But that gives you a way to basically run like a very, very small kind of micro EC2 instance to be able to kind of have that traffic to go out if
so you have to run that on your own though.
And I did try to run the WordPress website without having a NAT. I just turned it off and just to see what would happen. And you can still access the website. It was interesting. The website actually was slower to return data because I know that WordPress is probably making calls to other like third-party APIs, or the Jetpack plugin is like making calls out.
Yeah.
So the site was slower, but it was still functional, right?
Just get a bunch of timeouts probably.
Yeah, but then if you try to make if you try to update WordPress itself or to download a plugin or theme, you can't do that, right? So I debated, say, do I really need this managed NAT gateway or a NAT instance, and could I just get away without it? But it is nice to have that because it just makes your site more responsive, and allows you to make updates easier.
So you would, if you were going to update WordPress, you would do that through the WordPress update.
Yeah, the
UI that's built into WordPress.
Yeah.
You could also, I'm guessing, you could take your EFS and somehow mount it locally, ish, and then you could like if to do it, you needed to put this file on the server, you would just connect to the EFS mount and say, oh, I'm going to put this on, because EFS is essentially what is the file system for all of my containers that are running, my tasks in this context. Interesting.
Yeah.
And that's why I see, if I look at your diagram, I see your Fargate tasks going to a NAT, going to the internet. And it looked, from what I was saying, it looked like the EFS mount is just going to both Fargate tasks. So that's what I for some reason, I thought that the EFS mount was going through the EC2 NAT instance eventually, but I think it's not, if I'm understanding this correctly now. It's just showing that the EFS mount mounts to both Fargate tasks, and both Fargate tasks connect to the EC2 NAT to be able to get to the outside internet.
It's always fun to talk about a diagram.
I know
on a podcast, but that's like I say, if you go to my website, I have a diagram that I architected that shows the architecture for this, and then did a write to kind of explain it to a little bit of an easier understanding walkthrough of how this is set up. So it actually is working pretty well. Actually, I kind of like this. Like I said, I kind of used this from a blog post from AWS. It was a couple-year-old blog post that a developer wrote on how to kind of do somewhat most of this, but it was written using like CloudFormation and custom scripts. And so I was able to kind of take all that as kind of a starting point and then rewrite this in the CDK. And it's really nice as a kind of as a CDK construct. So it's almost purely serverless, but if you want to run WordPress on AWS in Fargate instances, that's kind of a good way to do it.
So I'm looking at the GitHub project now. So I could just grab your CDK project.
Yeah.
I'm guessing add my authentication credentials, right?
Yep.
And then just tell it to install.
Yep. Yeah. Once you get all the CDK libraries installed, you need to have the command line, all the utilities installed. But you can just do it and then just change a couple of config files, and then ready to go.
And those config files live on the EFS.
Yeah.
Can you change the config files by changing them in your, what I'm guessing is your repo, and then like telling CDK to upload them to EFS, or do you somehow connect to EFS and change them yourself?
Wait, what do you say config files? You mean as in the CDK config files?
There's at the end you say change the following lines in the Bitnami WordPress WP config.php.
Oh yeah, that's a little bit of a tricky thing too, because in order for this to work too, you need to actually change the WP config files that are stored on the EFS mount. So in order for you to do that, which is kind of tricky, you actually have to remote into one of the Fargate tasks with the command line. Then with like VI or some type of command line editor, you do need to go. There. Yes, you need to go and change it. I couldn't find a way to automate this, or with with a script or something. I could have done like a Lambda script that could basically automate the going into the task and kind of automatically doing this. But when I was kind of just working through this, I thought, okay, well, let me just kind of get in remote into that one Fargate task in order to access the EFS and then change the files there.
Because I know this is a little counterintuitive to the way most people run WordPress, but it feels to me like it'd be super helpful if, say, I could keep what is on EFS, because you're saying what's on EFS is my themes and my own config. If I could keep that in version control, and then with a command basically tell the CDK, take this file structure and put it on EFS. Or take EFS, because if I do like an update and it automatically changes some of those files, do an EFS sync down to me. Can you connect to EFS locally?
Not if you, unless you have some way to mount, like with some type of private connection, like you talked about with the VPN. If I if I connect into the VPC, if I connect privately to the VPC, I could probably, as long as I have a way to, with the command line, I could probably locally mount it. But
and then you could just edit it however you want.
Yeah, I could definitely do that if we need be.
But there's not, to your knowledge, there's not a CDK. I don't even like command or something that will change files on EFS.
No, because all the CDK does is just generate the CloudFormation template that then manages the actual deployment. So
gotcha. Well,
so
there it is.
So from a cost perspective, it works pretty well.
I was gonna say the transcript here is gonna be hilarious. But yeah, markcoberline.com. You have the whole write up and you have the GitHub repo, and like you said, $30 a month.
Yeah, $30 a month. As long as you get rid of that managed NAT gateway, if you kept those in it, it would be like $80 a month,
Yeah, which seems a little high.
which is kind of crazy. Yeah,
And you're running on 2 availability zones. Did you? I see you've got 2 Fargate tasks running in each availability zone.
That's also just to show you that if I want to have, let's say, some load balancing between the availability, say one availability zone went down, you could still have multiple tasks running. The other thing I'm doing with the tasks, which I didn't talk about, was also using Fargate spot instances too. So using the spot, which is super, super cheap, right? Because you know what way spot instances are used?
Kind of, isn't it like when there's availability, compute availability, you kind of like just get it?
Yeah, but they could also just turn off at any time too. So once AWS decides, oh, we need those resources someplace else.
Oh, so are you running 2 spot instances so they can always have one turned off?
That's the idea. But they're super cheap to run, and they don't really cost anything. But as long as you have them connected within the cluster with the load balancer, it's basically managed for you. So once one spot instance would go down, another would just spin up. But since you have them between multiple availability zones, and there's multiple tasks running in each of those availability zones,
so that's why you're running 2 tasks in each availability zone. So there's always should be one running.
Yeah.
And then, so you're saying that the cost to run a spot instance of a Fargate task must be less than half the cost to run a normal one.
Yeah, it's super cheap. Like my computing costs to run this, I think it's only like $6 a month for the tasks.
So everything's RDS then.
Yeah, RDS is
Yeah, your main cost is RDS.
Well, it's a combination.
Interesting.
It's a combination of RDS is still. I'm running a very small instance, so that's around between $8 to $10. I have to look at the actual number, but then
if you're saying your compute resources,
but then everything else together, you have EFS. It does add up. Yeah. But I try to keep the computing costs as low as possible. Using the Fargate spot instances, which I thought was pretty interesting. Oh, the other thing that I've also found from a cost perspective, which is kind of expensive the first month developing this, when I'm using the CDK and I'm trying to kind of get the right configuration set, I'm constantly deploying this and then tearing it down.
Right.
And every time you do that, AWS config, which is another service that runs, you get charged for every single change you make to your AWS account or your infrastructure gets logged with an AWS config. And that's, if you look at the pricing, it's super, super small.
But it is there.
But then if you think about all this infrastructure that's being deployed and then teared down, there's so many changes. What was happening was my config cost also started to get crazy big during that first month. And I had to I had to stop this because I could really bankrupt myself for the first month trying to deploy this WordPress website, because I'm trying to do it in a very iterative way too, because I don't want the infrastructure running. Also, if I deploy it and it's not the right setup, I just tear it down and then change the CD my stacks my TypeScript files, and then deploy it again. And every time you're doing that, if you're deploying a lot of infrastructure, it's going to have a cost associated with from an AWS config standpoint, and that is definitely not in the free tier.
Yeah.
So that was another thing I learned the hard way by paying for it during the first month.
So if your biggest cost, it seems like your biggest cost is RDS, right? Like single cost.
Single cost, I would say yes. Yeah. Yep.
It would be crazy, but you can't do RDS, not RDS, but you can't do MySQL as Fargate casts.
I thought about that.
That are mounted to EFS.
I thought about
back
that.
End, and then spot
that was another thing I thought about. Another way to take this is then try to do like an ECS Fargate cluster of just for the database.
Right.
Yeah, that was something I thought about too.
I feel like that'd be really crazy because you'd basically be saying some of these databases are going down all the time.
Yeah.
But you can connect to the others. So elect the new primary.
Correct.
That's so weird.
So that would be also an interesting thing about. Yeah. I don't know.
Fascinating. Well,
so it was an interesting experiment. And like I said, if I ever worked with a client that wanted to host a WordPress website on AWS, this is a nice, efficient way that's highly available, it's scalable.
It seems like it's a decent way to run any PHP app.
That's true.
That doesn't necessarily have a lot of complexity. You're connecting you're connecting to a database, right? And then if you have content, because like if you're running a PHP, I'm guessing EFS would, because if you create a post that has images, which you obviously did because it was the site that I'm guessing your article is on is that WordPress site,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah,
so you're hosting
yeah.
an image. Does the image get stored to EFS then, right?
You're talking about the container image?
No, I mean, like, if you're creating a post with image, you're like, hey, because you had your
Oh, where the
I'm looking at it
images are
right now.
stored. The actual
Yeah,
images. Oh yeah, they're stored in the EFS.
right on EFS, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have a simple application that needs to have both data and then store local files. Local files are in EFS. EFS is mounted on all the tasks. The tasks are just a container, right?
Yeah.
This is I mean, whether it's WordPress or something else, it seems like it's a good way to deploy a very lightweight PHP application. So there you go. Hey, we got to it.
We did.
We got to
in a roundabout way.
For all those listeners that were just like on
It's
the
always
edge of the seat,
it's always difficult to try and talk about this from a technical perspective, just knowing people are just listening to this.
Yeah.
That's always a little tricky. If we could actually display the diagram on the screen, it makes it a little bit easier to kind of walk through it.
Technically we could, but that feels less like a podcast and more
true.
like a TV show.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure we're ready to go there, Mark. So. But next week,
practice make
next
perfect
week,
eventually.
Who knows what progress we will make towards podboost.me becoming an actual product. Right? Is it podboost? Podboost.me?
Podboost.me.
Podboost.me. So not a sponsor yet, but who knows? Maybe the future host of this whole thing.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking of it as like a website hosting thing, but I thought it was an interesting idea for just hosting the files of the audio files and hosting the XML file.
It was interesting for me just to run the numbers on what I was doing this assembly and be like, yeah, you could build a clone of Podium for not that much.
All right, so I got some family stuff I gotta check in on. So I gotta